The federal courthouse was a place of law and order, but today, an oppressive weight hung in the air. The people seated in the gallery fidgeted uncomfortably, exchanging wary glances. Everyone knew Judge Marshall Davis had a reputation, and not a good one. On any given day, Davis ran his courtroom like a personal kingdom, where his word was absolute, and his biases were worn openly. But today there was something different about him, something darker. The tension exploded like a thunderclap. "I said no coffee in my courtroom," Davis roared, his voice echoing off the walls. His gavel cracked down like a gunshot. The young clerk, barely in her 20s, flinched so hard she nearly spilled a stack of files onto the floor. Her hands trembled as she stepped back, face flushed with embarrassment. Davis wasn't finished. "And if the defense team isn't here in 2 minutes, I'm issuing contempt charges." He scanned the courtroom, his gaze like a predator searching for weakness. The crowd sat still, as if breathing too loudly would earn them his wrath. Attorneys whispered among themselves, clearly used to his outbursts, but always on edge about when the next one would strike. Judge Davis settled into his chair, glaring at the door. His face was already red, his lips pressed into a thin line. There was no doubt he was waiting for one person in particular. The tension reached a boiling point when the court clerk, a woman who had spent years in Davis's courtroom and knew better than to disturb him unnecessarily, hesitated before speaking. "Your Honor," she began cautiously, "Vice President Vance has arrived for his testimony." For a moment, silence. Then a slow, curling sneer formed on Davis's lips. "Well, isn't that special?" he muttered, just loud enough for the room to hear. His tone dripped with mockery. "Make sure he knows this isn't the Senate floor. In my courtroom, his title means nothing." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Everyone knew this was more than just a legal proceeding. This was personal. Moments later, the heavy doors swung open and J.D. Vance stepped into the courtroom. Unlike the judge, Vance exuded calmness. His movements were measured, controlled. He nodded politely to the court staff, acknowledging their presence. He made his way to the witness stand, unshaken by the eyes watching him. Davis, however, didn't take his gaze off him. He drummed his fingers on the bench, his irritation barely contained. Finally, he leaned forward, speaking with slow, exaggerated enunciation, as if speaking to someone beneath him. "Let's get something straight." His voice dripped with contempt. "I don't care what position you hold in Washington. In this courtroom, I am the law. Is that clear, Mr. Vance?" A tense silence followed. The air was thick with the unspoken challenge. Then Vance met the judge's gaze without hesitation. His voice was even, his demeanor unreadable. "Crystal clear, Your Honor. I'm here simply as a witness to the truth." For a moment, something flickered in Davis's expression. Was it annoyance? Discomfort? Whatever it was quickly masked by a scoff. "We'll see about that." The game had begun. The sound of the gavel rang out again, snapping the room back to attention. The trial had officially begun, and Davis wasted no time making his intentions clear. The defense attorney, an experienced litigator who had weathered his fair share of difficult judges, stood with confidence. He knew this case would be tough, but he also knew that justice was on his side. What he didn't expect was the sheer hostility radiating from the bench before a single word of argument had even been spoken. "Your Honor," the attorney began, "we are here today to establish the facts surrounding Mr. Sterling's charitable work and financial transparency." Davis scoffed before slamming his gavel down hard. "I'm already tired of the political theatrics. This isn't a campaign rally. Move on!" The courtroom sat in stunned silence. The attorney hesitated for just a moment before pressing forward. "Your Honor, we are simply providing context." Davis let out a cold, humorless laugh. The only context that matters is that your client is accused of tax evasion. Period. I don't need a history lesson on his so-called charitable work." The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. There was something off about the way Davis was handling the case. Judges were expected to show some level of impartiality, but Davis wasn't even pretending. Vance sat back, watching intently. His posture remained composed, his expression unreadable. But he was listening. Every word, every inflection, every moment where Davis overstepped. Davis turned his focus back to the defense attorney. "Move on! You're wasting this court's time!" The defense attorney cleared his throat, adjusting his stance. "Very well, Your Honor. At this time, we would like to call our next witness, Vice President J.D. Vance." A wave of murmurs rippled through the gallery. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. J.D. Vance stood, walking to the witness stand with the same steady, composed energy he had shown upon entering. As he settled into his seat, Davis leaned forward, his eyes narrowing like a predator about to pounce. "Stand up straight when you take the oath!" The command was sharp, pointed. Vance didn't flinch. His posture was already impeccable, but Davis needed to assert control. "Speak clearly! I won't have any political doublespeak in my court." Vance's voice remained calm and respectful. "Your Honor, I can attest to Mr. Sterling's financial transparency, particularly regarding his Faith and Family Foundation." Davis let out an exaggerated sigh, rolling his eyes dramatically. "Oh, here we go. Another conservative fairy tale about family values." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Even the prosecution team exchanged uneasy glances. The judge wasn't just biased, he was openly hostile. And J.D. Vance had noticed. He wasn't rattled, he wasn't flustered, he just watched. He had seen men like Davis before, men who thought their power made them untouchable, men who underestimated the people who knew how to fight back. And as Davis continued his show of force, a small, almost imperceptible shift occurred in Vance's expression. He wasn't just testifying anymore. He was waiting for Davis to make his first mistake. And that mistake was coming. Fast. The courtroom was tense. Every person present could feel it. The weight of the moment. The unspoken battle that had already begun between J.D. Vance and Judge Davis. But while Davis had walked into the courtroom this morning believing he had complete control, that confidence was starting to crack. J.D. Vance, unshaken by the judge's obvious hostility, reached for his briefcase. His movements were measured, precise. The gallery watched in silence as he retrieved a folder and carefully placed it in front of him. Judge Davis's eyes flickered toward it. His fingers curled tighter around his gavel. "Your Honor," Vance said, his voice steady, "I have here documented evidence of Mr. Sterling's charitable contributions, including the March Foundation meetings." Before anyone could react, Davis shot up in his chair, his face twisting into something almost feral. "Those records are inadmissible!" He bellowed, slamming his gavel down so hard that it echoed through the chamber. A ripple of shock went through the courtroom. Even the prosecution exchanged uneasy glances. No one had even objected. The defense attorney slowly rose to his feet, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Honor, on what grounds?" "Don't you dare question my rulings," Davis snarled, pointing a trembling finger at him. "One more word and you'll be joining your client in contempt." But the damage was done. A courtroom is a place of logic, of order, of due process. Davis had just abandoned all pretense of fairness in front of a gallery full of people, and J.D. Vance had seen exactly what he needed to see. "Your Honor," Vance said, "these documents were properly submitted during discovery." Davis scoffed. "And I suppose your fancy White House connections had nothing to do with that?" The moment he said it, he knew he had made a mistake. The courtroom didn't move, but the atmosphere had shifted. J.D. Vance, instead of reacting with anger, simply leaned back in his chair. He let the moment linger. Then quietly, almost casually, he said, "Perhaps we should discuss the Liberty Foundation's protection payments." The change in Davis was immediate. His face, already flushed with anger, drained of all color. His hands, which had been gripping the arms of his chair, trembled slightly. His eyes darted toward the stack of papers on his desk, the folder he had barely looked at until now. The one that had appeared on his bench just this morning. J.D. Vance hadn't accused him of anything. He had simply asked a question, but the question had done its job. Davis was terrified, and everyone saw it. Judge Davis tried to steady his breathing. He was losing control, and he knew it. His mind raced. How does Vance know? For months he had been careful. There was no paper trail, at least none that could be traced back to him. The Liberty Foundation had made sure of that. So how, in the middle of his own courtroom, was Vance looking at him like he already knew everything? "I am holding you in contempt right now," Davis snapped, his voice cracking under the strain. "You think your position protects you? You're nothing but a Trump lackey in an expensive suit." The courtroom gasped. Even the prosecution, who had remained neutral so far, shifted uncomfortably. J.D. Vance didn't react to the insult. Instead, he reached into his briefcase again, this time pulling out a new document. "Your Honor," he said, "my position has nothing to do with this. But since you mentioned protection, let's discuss the Liberty Foundation's payments." Davis's face went from red to ashen white. The gavel in his hand shook. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The silence in the courtroom stretched on for what felt like forever. Then suddenly, the panic exploded. "How dare you!" Davis roared, slamming both hands on the bench. "I mean, what payments? There were no—" He stopped abruptly. Too late. He had already said too much. J.D. Vance tilted his head slightly, as if considering the judge's words. "No payments. Interesting, because these records show something different." He slid the paper across the table. A copy of offshore bank transactions, payments, dates, names. Davis froze. His breath was coming fast now. His eyes darted wildly around the courtroom. He was cornered. The court officers, who had stood silently at their posts all morning, exchanged uncertain glances. Then Davis did something no one expected. "Security, remove him!" he screamed. "Seize those documents! I am the law in this courtroom!" No one moved. The gallery, the officers, the prosecution. They all just stared. Judge Marshall Davis, the man who had spent years ruling with an iron fist, had just publicly broken. His power had relied on fear and control. But in that moment, he had neither. J.D. Vance slowly rose from his chair. "Your Honor," he said, his voice measured, "perhaps we should discuss why you're so eager to seize these particular documents." Davis pointed a trembling finger at him. "I don't have to explain myself to you." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. And then from the back of the courtroom, a new voice spoke. "Order denied." Every head in the room turned. A team of FBI agents was making its way down the aisle. The lead agent, his badge glinting under the fluorescent lights, held up a file of his own. "This court is now under federal investigation." Davis's body stiffened in shock. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. J.D. Vance sat back down. His job was done. But for Judge Marshall Davis, his nightmare was only beginning. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen. Judge Davis sat rigidly on his bench, his knuckles white as he gripped the armrests. His gaze darted wildly between J.D. Vance, the defense attorney, and the FBI agents now making their way down the aisle. The lead agent, a tall man with an unreadable expression, stopped just short of the bench. He held up a federal warrant. Judge Marshall Davis, you are now under federal investigation for corruption, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The room erupted into hushed murmurs. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide, struggling to process the unfolding spectacle. Davis shot up from his chair, knocking over his gavel in the process. His face was contorted with rage and disbelief. "You can't do this! I have immunity! I am a federal judge!" The agent remained calm. "Not anymore." J.D. Vance sat back in his chair, watching the scene unfold, his expression still calm, but there was no mistaking the sharp focus in his eyes. Davis turned his fury on him. "This is your doing, Vance!" His voice was near hysterical now. "You and your Trump-loving conservatives set me up!" But his words were meaningless. The walls were closing in. The lead agent nodded to his team, and one of them stepped forward, reading from a file. "We have financial records linking you to multiple offshore accounts, Your Honor. Direct payments from organizations and individuals who benefited from your rulings." Davis's breathing became erratic. He clawed at his robe, as if the very symbol of his authority would protect him. "Lies! Fabrications!" he bellowed. "This is a conservative conspiracy!" J.D. Vance finally spoke, his voice measured. "Your Honor, if it's all lies, why do your offshore bank statements show deposits that match your rulings against conservative defendants?" Davis snapped his head toward him, his entire body trembling. "How dare you?" "And let's not forget the sealed records from the Wilson hearing." Vance continued smoothly, his voice cutting through the judge's tirade like a blade. "You conveniently blocked all access to those files hours after meeting with Liberty Foundation representatives. Would you care to explain that?" Davis looked like a man on the edge of a breakdown. I don't have to explain anything to you." The court officers, who had been standing at attention, were no longer looking at Davis with respect. They were waiting for what they already knew was inevitable. The lead FBI agent took another step forward. "Judge Davis, if you resist arrest, additional charges will be added." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Then, in an act of sheer desperation, Davis lunged forward, reaching across the bench toward J.D. Vance's briefcase. He wasn't thinking anymore. He just wanted to destroy the evidence, but he never made it. The moment his feet hit the ground, the FBI agents moved in. Two officers grabbed his arms, twisting them behind his back. Handcuffs clicked shut. A stunned hush fell over the room. A federal judge in cuffs. His reign of terror was over. As Davis stood there, shackled before the very people he had once ruled over with unchecked authority, he thrashed violently against the officers. "You think this changes anything?" he howled. "There will always be others like me!" J.D. Vance slowly rose from his chair, adjusting his tie before locking eyes with him. "You're right about one thing, Judge Davis. There will always be people like you." He took a slow step forward, his voice steady. "But there will also always be people like me to stop you." Davis sneered, his lip curling in bitter rage. "You smug little—" The lead agent interrupted, nodding toward the officers. "Take him out." The courtroom watched in eerie silence as Judge Marshall Davis was led down the aisle in disgrace, his once imposing figure now reduced to a desperate, struggling man in handcuffs. As he passed the gallery, a woman in the front row, a small business owner whose case had been unjustly ruled against by Davis, let out a slow, relieved breath. Justice was finally being served. As Davis was dragged through the double doors, the weight of his downfall sank in. But this was only the beginning. The fallout begins. The media was waiting outside the courthouse, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Within hours, the news had spread like wildfire. Judge Davis' previous rulings were now under scrutiny. Every case he had presided over in the past decade was being reviewed. More judges and officials were implicated. The corruption network he had been a part of began to crumble. Meanwhile, inside the courtroom, Vance remained composed. He turned to the defense attorney. "Sterling's case?" The attorney nodded, checking his notes. "With the evidence Davis tried to suppress, there's no case left. It should be dismissed within the hour." Vance gave a small nod. Justice had prevailed. As he gathered his papers, he glanced toward the gallery. There were many who had doubted the system would ever hold someone like Davis accountable. But today was proof that the fight for truth and justice was far from over. Vance turned, walking toward the exit as murmurs of shock and relief rippled through the courtroom. The battle was won. But the war against corruption, that fight was just getting started. If you believe in standing up for truth and accountability, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more inspiring stories.